This happened in the fall of 2021 when I was living alone for the first time in a rented townhouse in southern Illinois. I was 27, working full-time, technically an adult with a decent routine, but the idea of living by myself still made me nervous. I'd just gone through a bad breakup and thought some quiet and solitude might help me sort my head out. The townhouse was one of several identical units in a little row, plain but clean, tucked into a dead-end cul-de-sac off a rural highway. The neighborhood had that bland suburban feel, beige vinyl siding, trimmed hedges, wind chimes, and mailboxes with family names stenciled on them. Mostly older people, a few young families. I didn't really know any of my neighbors, which was exactly how I liked it. Pretty quickly, though, one person stood out. He lived 3 doors down. Tall, heavyset, mid-40s, scruffy beard. He had this strange habit of standing outside his place at night. Sometimes he paced or smoked, but more often he just stood there. I'd pull into my driveway after work around 9 or 10 p.m., and he'd be out front, leaning against the porch rail or standing at the edge of his driveway, facing the street. He never waved or smiled. Even if I looked right at him, he just stared. I tried to shrug it off. When I mentioned it to my mom or friends, they said he was probably just a night owl or had insomnia. But there was something about him that unsettled me. It wasn't just that he was there, it was the way he was there. Completely still. No phone, no fidgeting, no shifting his weight. Just a motionless figure in the dark, watching but never joining in. I kept telling myself I was overreacting. Then the noises started. It was mid-September the first time I heard it. I'd just gotten home from a late shift managing inventory at a distribution center. I usually rolled in around 10:30 p.m., scarfed something quick, and crashed. That night I fell asleep around midnight. At 2:37 a.m. on the dot, I woke up to a sound like metal scraping against wood. At first I thought I'd dreamed it. Then it came again, a long, slow creak, like an old gate being opened. My bedroom was on the first floor at the back of the unit. A sliding glass door with vertical blinds led to a small, fenced backyard. The yard was covered entirely in decorative rock instead of grass, so every step made a distinct crunch. I sat up, heart racing, and listened. Silence for a few seconds. Then, soft, deliberate footsteps moving across the gravel. These were not animal sounds. I grabbed my phone and the only weapon I had, a dull kitchen knife I irrationally kept in my nightstand, and crept to the sliding door. I crouched beside it and peeked through the blinds. Nothing. The motion light over the patio was off, which meant either whoever it was out of its range or had gotten in another way. I dialed 911. The dispatcher was calm, took my address, and said officers were on their way. I stayed in the dark, barely breathing. About 10 minutes later, red and blue lights washed across my front window. I went to the door and met the 2 officers outside, explaining what I'd heard and when. One went around the back while the other stayed with me, asking basic questions. The officer who checked the yard came back and said the gate was closed, the latch was engaged, and there were no obvious signs of tampering. No footprints, no damage. He said he'd file a report, but his partner made a comment about raccoons and gave me a look like I'd wasted their time. I didn't argue. They left after another few minutes. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I went out to the backyard myself. That's when I noticed it. A flat stone about the size of a paperback, wedged under the bottom edge of the wooden gate. The gate had a heavy spring that normally pulled it shut automatically. With that rock in place, it wouldn't fully close. It would look closed, but it wouldn't latch. It looked intentional, like something someone would do if they wanted to slip in later without making a sound. I picked the rock up and hurled it across the yard. Then I called the police again and told them what I'd found. They said they'd add it to the report, but repeated there wasn't much they could do. When I asked if they could talk to neighbors or see if anyone had cameras, they said without a crime, there was nothing to investigate. I started wondering if I really was losing it. 2 nights later, things escalated. At 2:14 a.m. exactly, I woke to the sound of my back door handle turning. At first it was a gentle rattle like someone lightly testing it. Then it got harder, more insistent like someone trying to force it open. I sat up, heart slamming in my chest. I couldn't see anything through the blinds, but I could feel someone standing on the other side of that door. With shaking hands, I called 911 again and slid into the hallway, out of line of sight from the glass. I held that same useless kitchen knife and tried to stay quiet. My motion light flicked on outside. Through a thin gap in the blinds, I saw a shadow move across the glass. A man's silhouette. He didn't bolt or duck away. He just stood there. The same two officers showed up. This time they found clear footprints in the gravel, large ones leading straight to the back door. But since no one had actually broken in, they claimed there was still not enough to go on. They said they'd increase patrols and reminded me to keep everything locked. The next day I went out and bought a pair of mid-range Wi-Fi security cameras. I mounted one over the back door and another over the front porch. That night, I didn't go to bed. I sat in the dark living room watching the camera feeds on my phone. 2:14 came and went. Nothing. At 2:23 the back camera alerted. A man stepped into frame. He came through the gate like he knew the layout, keeping to the blind spots until the last second. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a black hoodie with the hood up, jeans and gloves. He walked right up to the glass door, looked straight up into the camera and smiled. A slow, stretched-out grin. Then he backed away while still staring at the lens and melted back into the dark. I called the police again. They watched the clip in my living room and admitted it was definitely creepy, but repeated their line. No break-in, no damage, no visible weapon, no crime. They wouldn't even go down the street and ask one of the neighbors to check their doorbell cam. I begged them. They said their hands were tied. That night I packed a bag and slept at a hotel. When I came back the next day, there were 4 muddy handprints on the glass door. Too high, too low, like someone had crouched down and rested both hands on the glass to stare in. I moved out a week later. Broke the lease, lost my deposit, didn't care. I couldn't spend another night there. The final straw was a note I found wedged in my mailbox the day I left. Lined notebook paper, cramped handwriting. It said, "The cops leave, but I don't." I filed one last police report. The officer who took it actually looked disturbed and said they'd do a wellness check on the neighborhood, but it was too late for me. I never went back. About a month later, I got a Facebook message from a girl named Kayla. She said she'd just moved into my old unit. Her message read, "Hi, sorry to bother you. I think you used to live here. Did you ever have someone in a black hoodie hanging around the backyard? I keep hearing footsteps at night. And last night someone knocked on the glass door around 2 a.m. and just stood there." I didn't reply. I didn't want to know what happened next. I work for a property preservation company. We handle foreclosed houses, changing locks, cleaning them out, winterizing, sometimes boarding them up after vandalism. It's not exactly glamorous, but it pays well, and most days it's just quiet, solitary work. You spend a lot of time in houses that used to belong to people who are long gone. Sometimes it's depressing, sometimes it's mind-numbingly dull. Every so often, though, a place feels wrong the moment you step inside. This happened in 2020. I'd been assigned a property in a rural part of upstate New York. The town was barely hanging on. A single gas station, most storefronts empty, cracked roads with weeds pushing through. The house was a small one-story place down a dirt road with overgrown brush and woods on 3 sides. No other homes in sight, just trees and silence. According to the file, the previous owner, an elderly woman, had died. No heirs claimed the estate, so the bank foreclosed. The utilities had been off for over a year. My job was to document anything left behind, clear it out, and secure the place for winter. I pulled up on a Monday at about 9 a.m. with a small box truck and my gear. From the outside, everything looked intact. Windows shut, roof fine, door locked. Vines and weeds had nearly swallowed the porch. The front door had swollen in the frame, so I had to shoulder it open. Inside, it smelled like stale air and dust. Old furniture, faded curtains, nothing out of the ordinary. Then my work phone rang. It startled me because I'd already checked and had no reception out there. No bars, but it buzzed anyway. Caller ID just said unknown caller. I answered. Nothing. Just a low, crackling static. I said hello a couple of times, got no response, and hung up, figuring it was a glitch. I went back to my usual routine, taking photos of every room and item. The living room looked like a time capsule. Heavy furniture, lace curtains, doilies, porcelain figurines. It reminded me of my grandmother's place. The hallway carried a faint smell, not rot exactly, more like mildew, dust, and a hint of something metallic. There were 3 bedrooms. One was almost empty except for a sagging mattress on the floor. Another had been a sewing room, with thread spools scattered everywhere and a dusty sewing machine on a desk. On the wall was a corkboard covered in old newspaper clippings, obituaries, all local, dozens of them, neatly cut and pinned. I didn't recognize any of the names. I kept moving. The master bedroom held an off-white rotary phone on the nightstand, yellowed with age, a long curled cord drooping off the table. The kind of phone that should have been permanently dead with the line cut off. I moved on to the bathroom. That's when my phone rang again. My work cell, unknown caller. This time I hesitated before answering. I stepped into the hallway, put it to my ear, and said hello. At first, just silence. Then, after about 5 seconds, a whisper, so soft I had to strain to hear it. Don't answer the phone in the bedroom. Then the line went dead. I froze in the hall, heart slamming in my chest. The whole house was silent. All the windows were closed. No cars in the drive, no sign anyone else was around. My rational brain said prank. Maybe one of the other guys from the company messing with me, but nobody else knew I'd shown up that early, and I still didn't have reception. I glanced at my phone. 1 bar flickered up, then dropped back to nothing. When I tried calling my supervisor, the call failed. I decided to hurry up and get it over with. I started boxing up knickknacks and glassware in the living room, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept looking toward the dark end of the hallway, half expecting to see someone standing there. Then a phone rang again. Not my cell this time, the rotary phone in the bedroom. The sound carried through the house, sharp, mechanical, the old-fashioned bell kind of ring. That phone had no business ringing. The line was disconnected. There was no dial tone when I tested it, no active service, but it kept ringing again and again. I walked slowly down the hallway, my cell still in my hand, even though it was useless. I stopped in the bedroom doorway. The rotary phone sat on the nightstand, receiver trembling slightly with each shrill ring. There was no way I was picking it up. Eventually it stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than the noise. I backed out of the room. I wanted to bolt, but part of the job is checking every part of the property, including the basement. I almost said screw it and left it uninspected, but pride, or stubbornness, pushed me downstairs. The basement door was off the kitchen. I opened it and started down, flashlight in hand. The steps creaked under my weight. The air grew colder, damp with mold and the coppery hint of rust. Shelves lined the walls, holding old paint cans and random junk. In the far corner stood a small table. On the table was a cordless phone, a newer model. Gray plastic coated in dust. Next to it sat a stack of yellowed notebooks. I picked up the top one and flipped it open. Every page had the same format: a name, a date, a short note. Lena H., July 3, 2019. Rang once, didn't answer. Carl M., September 12, 2019. Picked up, warned him. On and on, line after line. Dozens of entries. My stomach dropped. I suddenly felt exposed, like the darkness around me had eyes. I dropped the notebook and scanned the corners of the basement, certain someone was hiding just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I bolted up the stairs, looking over my shoulder the whole way, heart in my throat. I didn't bother finishing. I got in my truck and drove straight back to the office. On my report, I didn't write any of that. I just said the property seemed unsafe and there might be squatters or interference. They reassigned the job to another crew. 2 days later, I got a text from one of the guys, Mark. He'd gone out to finish the work. His text said, "The phone in the bedroom with no service rang while I was in there." "What the hell?" I called him immediately. He sounded rattled. He said he'd heard the rotary ring, refused to answer it, and got out as fast as he could. The next day he quit. No notice, no explanation, just gone. He's still around. I checked his Facebook months later, but we've never talked again. My boss did end up calling the police to report possible squatters. They checked the place and found nobody inside. To this day, I don't know what was going on in that house. The remote location, the obituaries, the calls I got with no service, that whisper on the line, the dead phone that wouldn't stay dead. It all felt like walking into a horror movie set. In my head, it boils down to two options: an elaborate sick prank I still can't explain, or something worse. Music. This last thing happened in 2019. I was in my late 20s, living alone in a small rental house on the quiet edge of town. The place was old, one story, creaky floors, thin walls, tiny backyard, but it was cheap, and it had a basement. I used that for storage, extra furniture, tools, boxes I didn't feel like unpacking. I moved in during the spring. For a few months, everything was normal. The house had its quirks. Pipes rattled when I turned on the shower. One kitchen cabinet never stayed shut, but nothing that felt out of place for an older rental. The only part I didn't like was the basement. The door was in the hallway by the bathroom. It was heavy, stuck a little when you pulled it, and the light switch for the basement was halfway down the stairs. That meant walking several steps in total darkness before you could reach it. The first time I went down there, I remember feeling uneasy. Not outright scared, just watched. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, barely lighting the corners. It smelled like old wood and dust. I dropped my stuff down there, closed the door, and mostly forgot about it. That changed in late October. One night I got home from my night shift security job around 3 a.m. I was heading to the bathroom before bed when I heard a noise behind me. 3 soft knocks, faint but clear. They came from the basement door. I froze. I stood there listening hard. At first I told myself it was the pipes or the house settling. Then it came again. 3 distinct taps, knuckles on wood. I took a few steps back and stared at the door. Nothing else happened. I whispered, "It's just the house," even though I didn't believe it. I didn't open the door. I went to my bedroom, locked it, and stayed awake for the next 2 hours with the TV on, listening for any more sounds. In the morning, I forced myself to check. I opened the basement door, went down into the dim light, and looked around. Everything was as I'd left it. No broken windows, no moved boxes, no footprints in the dust. I convinced myself it had to be normal house noise, or maybe a raccoon in the walls. A few nights later, it happened again. I was in the bathroom brushing my teeth when I heard a single, hard knock, louder than before, right on the basement door. I slowly opened the bathroom door. The basement door was closed, the hallway was still. I walked up to it and pressed my ear against the wood. At first, silence. Then, so faint I almost doubted it, I heard breathing. Slow, steady, like someone standing on the other side, listening. I backed away and shut myself in my bedroom again, locking the door. The next day, I called my landlord. I told him I was hearing noises from the basement, and that I thought someone might have gotten inside somehow. He sounded doubtful but agreed to come take a look. We went down there together the following morning. He checked the small windows, the walls, the foundation. Nothing was damaged. No signs of forced entry or animals. Everything looked untouched. I didn't push it. I couldn't prove what I'd heard. For about a week, nothing else happened. I started to think maybe I'd just been overtired and imagining things. I was working weird hours after all. Then one night around 2 a.m., I was on the couch watching TV when I heard it, the slow creak of the basement door opening. I muted the TV and listened. The sound continued, hinges grinding as the heavy door swung on its frame. I stood up and peered down the hallway. The basement door was wide open. I hadn't touched it in over a week. I grabbed a flashlight and with my heart in my throat walked toward it. I didn't have anything to defend myself with, but I couldn't just sit there. I stood at the top of the stairs and shone the beam down. The basement below was completely black. The overhead bulb was off. I reached around the corner and flipped the switch. Nothing. The bulb was burnt out. That's when I heard footsteps on the stairs. Slow, deliberate steps coming up from the dark. I stumbled backward, my hands shaking, and slammed the basement door shut. I held the handle with both hands. For a moment I felt pressure from the other side, like someone was leaning or pushing against it. Then it stopped. I locked the door and called 911, telling them someone was in my basement. 2 officers arrived about 10 minutes later. They did a full sweep of the house and went downstairs. I waited outside in the cold, watching the windows, waiting to hear something. Eventually they came back up. They said they didn't find anyone. No evidence of forced entry, no disturbed items, nothing. One of them tried to joke it off, asking if I'd been watching horror movies before bed. They left. I stood on the front lawn for a few minutes, staring at the house, before finally going back in and locking everything. I stayed awake until sunrise. The next morning, I bought a heavy padlock and installed it on the basement door. I didn't care if the landlord liked it or not. I needed it to feel like that door would stay shut. For the next month, nothing happened. No knocks, no creaks, no footsteps. I started to relax. Then one night I came home from work and saw the basement door was slightly open. The padlock was on the floor, snapped in half. I hadn't touched that lock since I'd put it on. I just stood there, staring at the broken metal, and a new realization hit me. Every time something had happened, every knock, every sound, every time the door opened, it had always been in the middle of the night, always when I was the only one in the house. I didn't go downstairs. I couldn't. I threw some clothes and essentials into a bag and left. I stayed at a friend's place for a few days, trying to figure out what to do. When I finally went back, I didn't even bother trying to check the basement. I nailed the basement door shut, top to bottom, and shoved a chair under the handle for good measure. A few nights later, around 3 a.m., I was lying in bed when I heard a sound I still can't fully describe. A voice. Not loud and not words, more like the low vibration of someone trying to speak, a rumble in their throat. It came from beneath the floor, directly under my bed. That was it for me. I called the police one last time. They came, searched, found nothing. Same story. After they left, I packed everything I could carry except for what was in the basement and walked out. I didn't wait for my lease to end. I didn't care about the deposit. I just left. I still don't know what was down there, and I don't want to. Sometimes, in my new apartment, when I'm awake at 3 a.m. for no good reason, I think about that house and that nailed-shut door, and I wonder what I might have seen if I'd waited at the top of those stairs just a little longer.